Hello, my name is Benzie Kluger, and I am an associate professor of neurology and psychiatry at the University of Colorado. And I was invited to talk today about marijuana, also known as cannabis, and medical marijuana, and Parkinson's disease, and what we really know about this topic. And it's definitely a topic that is very timely, and that there's been a lot of curiosity and questions about. So I'm honored to be able to share what we know with you today. As disclosures, I have no financial disclosures related to the work that I'm presenting. However, I do live in the state of Colorado, which is rapidly becoming one of the cannabis capitals of the United States and possibly also the world. So our objectives during this talk today are to define some of the terminology. So under the heading of marijuana, there's the term cannabis, cannabinoids, and endocannabinoids. We want to review some of the basic science. By basic science, I mean studies that have been done in animals and in cells of the potential of cannabinoids to affect Parkinson's disease and also other movement disorders. This is an area that's really taken off over the last 10 to 20 years as we've discovered that particularly the basal ganglia is very heavily populated with cannabinoid receptors. We want to understand what the current state of evidence of cannabinoids are as a treatment for Parkinson's, and particularly how they work in people. And lastly, and I think also very importantly, to know the most common side effects of cannabinoid-based therapies. And we'll spend a little time talking about how cannabinoids and cannabis is used in the state of Colorado, and this is likely to vary between state to state and also between different countries. So welcome to Colorado, where we've had medical marijuana for over 10 years, and it's now completely legal for all adults. So again, we'll go over how cannabis affects the nervous system. We'll talk about motor and non-motor symptoms, and also if there's any evidence that cannabinoids can slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. So as a place to start, what is cannabis, cannabinoids, and endocannabinoids? So cannabis, as also known as marijuana and Mary Jane and a whole host of other names, is a genus of flowering plants. And this includes several different subspecies, including sativa. And we'll talk about the types of cannabinoids later. But sativa is particularly potent with regards to THC. Indica is another species of cannabis, and indica has more CBD, as does ruderalis, and ruderalis is hardly ever used medically. Cannabinoids are chemicals that act on cannabinoid receptors in the nervous system and other tissues, and cannabinoids may be synthetic, meaning that they are man-made. There may be phytocannabinoids, which mean they're derived from the cannabis plant itself, and there's now over 100 cannabinoids that have been discovered. And endocannabinoids are cannabinoids that are actually produced by our own neurons and our own tissues. For people who are familiar with the idea of endorphins, so these are chemicals that our neurons produce that act on opiate receptors. The similar analogy is that endocannabinoids are cannabinoids that our body produces that act on cannabinoid receptors. The two most well-known and well-characterized phytocannabinoids are delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, also known as THC, and this is the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. And so if you've heard of the new strains of cannabis and how they are 10 to 30 times stronger than the types of cannabis that was available in the 1970s, they're really referring to the concentration of THC. Cannabidiol, or CBD, is something that's been really more in the news and more interest lately, and it may have more calming effects on the nervous system. A few years ago, there was a lot of interest in a particular strain of cannabis called Charlotte's Web, and many people were moving from all over the country and even all over the world to Colorado to use Charlotte's Web, which had a very high concentration of CBD for epilepsy. And we're not going to talk about it today, but there is an accumulating amount of evidence that CBD may be helpful for certain types of epilepsy. And as I talked about, that the concentration in indica and ruderalis is higher for CBD. And so when people are looking for CBD, they may get certain strains that are higher in this particular cannabinoid. Endocannabinoids, I'll really just talk about a single one, which is anandamide, which comes from the Sanskrit word for bliss, which was discovered in 1992. And anandamide may play a role in several functions, and this becomes important later as we talk about non-motor symptoms, but it's important for pain, it's important for sleep, it can be important for other behaviors, and it also seems to play a role in brain development. Interestingly, anandamide is also found in chocolate, and it may be part of the pleasurable sensations that chocolate lovers experience beyond just the taste of chocolate. Synthetic cannabinoids include prescription medications, and Marinol, also known as dronabinol, was the first of these, which is a synthetic form of THC, and that has been used for quite some time to help people with nausea and appetite who are undergoing chemotherapy. A newer one is called nabilone, and this is a direct agonist at cannabinoid receptors. So it directly stimulates these receptors, similar to in Parkinson's disease, we have dopamine agonist medications that directly stimulate receptors. And there are also a number of synthetic cannabinoids such as K2 and spice that, at least in the United States, are oftentimes found at truck stops and other locations that are legal alternatives to cannabis. These have been associated with a number of adverse health effects and hospitalizations and even deaths. And so it's best to try to avoid those types of products. So how does cannabis affect the nervous system? I put up the slide here, if people recognize them. They're two famous American actors, Cheech and Chong. And I always like to ask people when I start the talk about when people are smoking cannabis or marijuana, they tend to move faster or slower. And so most people who've had any experience around people who have been stoned or who are smoking marijuana can tell you that they usually move slower. And I bring this up because I think sometimes people have unrealistic expectations for what cannabis may be able to do for people. Cannabis can be helpful for certain things, but if you directly stimulate cannabinoid receptors, you actually decrease dopamine and you make people or animals move slower. And so the idea that cannabis is going to end up being a cure-all for Parkinson's disease or even helpful for many of the symptoms of Parkinson's is, I think, a little bit misplaced. That being said, that within cannabis and within marijuana, there are both agonists, so things that stimulate cannabinoid receptors, and antagonists. And so it may depend on the particular strain, but just to take a step back, that it's pretty unlikely, and I would actually advise against it to stop taking levodopa and other medications like that and try to treat your Parkinson's disease completely with cannabis or cannabinoids. So within the nervous system, there is something called the endocannabinoid system, and there are two main receptors, which we call CB1 and CB2. And CB1, or cannabinoid receptor 1, is primarily in the central nervous system, and in particular, it's very concentrated in the basal ganglia. When this cannabinoid receptor is stimulated, it tends to increase GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it decreases glutamate, and it also decreases dopamine release in the basal ganglia. So it tends to overall have a calming effect when you stimulate these receptors. There are many types of cannabinoids, and so there are agonists, which are basically compounds that will stimulate the receptor and tend to have a calming effect. There are antagonists, so things that block the receptor, and those can have a stimulating effect. And then there are partial agonists, and those would depend on the state of the person or the state of the animal at the time that they're given on what kind of effect they would have, but they tend to be more modulatory. Cannabinoids also have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects, and this is part of the reason why there's some excitement around their potential for helping slow down neurodegenerative diseases as well as other types of diseases like autoimmune diseases. The CB2 receptors are on microglia, which are the primary immune cells in the nervous system, and there has been increasing interest in modulating or turning down microglia as a way to potentially slow down or halt the progression of Parkinson's disease. So this is also a target of interest. And then there are effects that are independent of cannabinoid receptors. And an example of this is the adenosine A2A receptor, which interestingly is the same receptor that's acted on by caffeine, but there are also a number of medications that are being developed for the treatment of Parkinson's disease that work on the adenosine A2A receptor. So, do cannabinoids improve motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease? And I bring up this slide. There was a very famous snowboarder in Canada who won a gold medal and then temporarily had his gold medal taken away because he tested positive for cannabis. His medal was returned to him when it was thought that, and I think rightfully so, that cannabis is really not a performance-enhancing drug. And so going back to my earlier point, that cannabis is unlikely to be a very potent modulator for helping things like bradykinesia or slowness, but may be helpful for some of the other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Regarding animal models, the published studies generally support motor improvements, but our effects of these are mixed, as are mechanisms. And in some animal models, and depending on what type of cannabinoid is being used, many of them actually show worsening of motor function. And not surprisingly, if you directly stimulate the cannabinoid receptors, that people actually will have, or animals will have, slowing and worsening of their Parkinsonism. So, if we think back to the slide before, that there's over 100 cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, that it's obviously very important what the relative proportions of those are regarding how they are going to affect you as somebody with Parkinson's disease or animals in terms of how they will affect motor symptoms. The most consistent results are that if you block the CB1 receptor, that you get more improvement in motor symptoms, and this probably happens through non-dopaminergic mechanisms, potentially through the A2A receptor. And both cannabinoid agonists and antagonists have been reported to improve dyskinesias. And this shouldn't be too surprising that if you're able to reduce dopamine, that you may be able to improve the symptoms of having too much dopamine or dyskinesias. Regarding clinical reports and trials, there have been a couple of case series, one of which was, I believe, from the Czech Republic, that had a survey of over 300 patients. And granted, as a survey study, there's always the potential for selection bias, namely that people who have tried cannabis and it didn't help them, or who are not interested in cannabis, didn't respond. But 25% of the respondents reported that they used cannabis, and of those, 46% of them described that they had some benefit. 31% reported some improvement of rest tremor. 45% felt like it helped some of their slowness of movement, and 14% reported that it helped them with dyskinesias. In the United States, myself and some colleagues reported a study of 207 patients who were randomly selected from our clinic. And at that time, which was a few years ago, only 5% reported cannabis use. And I would say that this probably stayed pretty stable between 5 to 10% of people in our practice using cannabis. And most of them in our sample reported benefit only for their non-motor symptoms. So things like sleep and pain and anxiety, and that there weren't very reliable responses in terms of motor symptoms. That being said, and this is also purely anecdotal, I do have some patients who report that use of cannabis can help them smooth out some of their on and off symptoms and may help them some with dyskinesias. But this has not been backed up in any trials, and there have been a number of randomized controlled trials to date, and they would all be described as either negative or inconclusive. And when I say that they're negative trials, that they were able to find no benefit over placebo, but I would also say that they're inconclusive, namely that they only tested a single dose of cannabis, they only tested a single strain of cannabis, and the sample sizes were relatively small compared to studies that are done on medications. So I would say that the bottom line from all of these studies is that there is definitely more work that needs to be done. There's no convincing or overwhelming evidence that marijuana or cannabis is helpful for motor symptoms, but there are ongoing trials. In fact, we have a trial going on here at the University of Colorado trying a higher dose of just pure CBD to see if we are able to benefit resting tremor while not producing unwanted side effects. So our second question is, do cannabinoids improve non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease? And this is a picture of somebody with the munchies, and that's definitely a well-known effect of cannabis, is that it can help with nausea and appetite. And in fact, that was the first medical use of cannabis, was to help people with cancer, and particularly people undergoing chemotherapy, to try to regain their appetite and stimulate them to have weight gain, as well as better control nausea. Regarding clinical reports, there are to date no randomized controlled trials that I am aware of. There are definitely a number of case series that are out there, and they suggest that there may be some benefit for REM behavior disorder. REM behavior disorder is a condition where people will act out their dreams, oftentimes fighting or kicking or screaming during the night. Many times the patient does not remember this, but their bedmate, if they have one, or if they haven't separated beds yet, can definitely tell you about it. And the problem with REM behavior disorder is that it can cause disrupted sleep, and so even if somebody sleeps 8 or 10 hours, they may not feel rested in the morning. There was also an interesting study using cannabidiol specifically for psychosis in people with Lewy body dementia that suggested some benefit. Our experience in Colorado suggests that cannabis, not surprisingly, can help with appetite and nausea, and this would be consistent with cannabis use in a number of other diseases, that it can help for pain, and I'll talk later about how we use it for pain with people with Parkinson's as well as other conditions. It may be helpful for anxiety, and it may also be helpful for sleep. Again, this is uncontrolled and anecdotal data. I would say that, for almost any of these conditions, I definitely run across almost an equal number of people where cannabis does not help them. So like any other medications, there's some people where it does help and some people where it does not. And so again, you want to take it with a grain of salt. And at the end of the talk, I'll kind of go over my own personal approach of how I counsel patients to use cannabis if that's something that they're interested in doing. The most common side effects, and not only from our clinical practice, but also reported from the randomized clinical trials, include cognitive side effects, feeling dopey. That should also certainly come as no surprise to anybody, given that the effects of cannabis, and sometimes even the desired effects for people who are using cannabis to party or enjoy themselves, is really just to turn their minds down. Related to that, it can also make apathy worse. So apathy is a symptom of Parkinson's disease where people have a loss of motivation. And again, not surprisingly, that cannabis, one of its well-known side effects, particularly in adolescents, is that it can lower motivation. Dizziness and low blood pressure. These are actually very important side effects. As people listening in may know, Parkinson's itself can cause problems with low blood pressure. It's something we call orthostatic hypotension, and this can lead to passing out or to falls. And so this is actually a very serious side effect, in that it could lead to, for instance, a broken hip or other complications of a fall. Smoking cannabis, and this is a little bit controversial, but it looks like may increase the risk for cancer and other pulmonary issues. And edible forms of cannabis may have less predictable absorption and dosing than smoking, and so it's possible, and this is something that's come up in the state of Colorado, that people, oftentimes children, may get into edibles, may have 1 or 2 or more candies, and that they have a delayed effect in that, within an hour or two, that child or adult may end up in the emergency department having problems with their walking or balance or confusion, because they didn't notice any immediate effect from the cannabis that they were taking. So lastly, before getting into the more practical part of the talk, can cannabinoids slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease? And this is just the cover of one of many books, and this is something that's very much hyped in the state of Colorado, cannabis for cancer and other illness, and it's being touted as a miracle herb, and sometimes people who are doing perfectly well with their Parkinson's disease will ask me if they should also be taking cannabis because of something they've seen on the internet or something that their kids have told them. So preclinical models, namely animal studies and cell-based studies, suggest that there may be neuroprotective effects, and they are mostly done in what we call toxin-based models. And so with Parkinson's disease in animals, we can induce a condition that looks like Parkinson's disease by giving animals particular toxins. And the most commonly used one is something called MPTP. Also the pesticide rotenone can be used, and so these have been shown to be protective of that, but these are not necessarily the best models of human disease, and these have not been tested, at least to my knowledge, in any genetic forms of Parkinson's. Nonetheless, the mechanisms of how they help these toxin-based models seem to include anti-inflammatory effects and microglial effects. And so it seems that cannabis, through multiple different pathways, may be able to slow down some of the inflammation that happens in the brain that seems to mediate Parkinson's disease. It's still controversial whether this is something that drives the progression of Parkinson's disease or whether it's responsive to other changes in Parkinson's. Nonetheless, in these animal models, it does seem to potentially slow down the progression. There are a number of studies that suggest that cannabinoid receptors are really not necessary for these effects. And to date, there is no data in people. And so at this point, I certainly would not recommend that people with Parkinson's disease start using cannabis or CBD or any other of these products simply to try to slow down their Parkinson's disease. If people are interested in slowing down their Parkinson's, I would strongly encourage them to exercise, to take their medications on a regular basis. But until we have better evidence, I would be quite skeptical at the current time of whether or not cannabis would have any significant benefit on slowing the progression of Parkinson's disease. Let me back up 1 second here. Before going into the take-home messages, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what I do in my day-to-day clinical practice. So in the state of Colorado, and this is true in many other states in the United States, and I believe this is also similar in some parts of the world, although I'm definitely not an expert in the legal status of cannabis in other countries. I do not write a prescription for cannabis. What I am able to do is fill out paperwork, and patients can get a license to go to a medical dispensary. In the state of Colorado, people can also go to a recreational dispensary. The advantages in Colorado are that if people have a license, they pay 40% less on their product because they don't have to pay the tax, and they also have access to more products. Like many alternative medicines, and I would put cannabis in that category, it is not regulated in the United States, and I don't know if it is better regulated in other countries, but this means that if I go to a particular dispensary to buy a product and it says it has 10 milligrams of CBD, and I go across the street and I buy another product that says it has 10 milligrams of CBD, there's really no regulatory body that will ensure that those two products are equivalent. And so one of the things that I do tell patients is that they should work with a single dispensary when they are getting medical marijuana so that they can really get a more predictable product. But even at the same dispensary, there may be differences between batch to batch. Second thing when I counsel patients about using cannabis products is really try to figure out what are the symptoms that we are trying to target. For some symptoms, particularly pain, I find cannabis can be very helpful. There's actually an interesting emerging literature that cannabis can help to reduce opioid use. And there's, as people may know, increasing concern about opiate abuse and opiate overdoses. And so we are really happy with that. Cannabis may also have less side effects than opiates and other medications that we're using for pain. Depending on the type of pain people are having, we will often start with creams or patches. And so using topical cannabis can get around some of the side effects like hypotension and confusion that we see with oral products. Same thing with the patches. If people are going to use an oral product, I'll oftentimes have them start with CBD or cannabidiol, and that it tends to be more relaxing and to have less side effects. However, for pain, for nausea, for muscle spasticity, there is some evidence, and we've definitely had some patients who do better with a combination product of CBD and THC. But nonetheless, for side effects, I like to start with just a pure CBD product. When people start any marijuana product, I tell them to start with even half of the dose that's suggested by the person at the dispensary. and to go up slowly, maybe, for instance, if they're giving CBD drops, that they might start with 1 drop and do that at night and do that for a week and see how things go, and then they can go up slowly from there. I will definitely go over the potential side effects with them to make sure that we are getting appropriate bang for our buck. And then to just have reasonable expectations and to continue to follow up and to keep me in the loop with what they have been taking. I definitely have heard from other practitioners of patients who have come in with worsening apathy or cognitive problems or balance, who initially were not sharing with their clinician or physician that they were taking cannabis, and then it was later found out that they were taking cannabis, and when they stopped that, some of those side effects went away. So our take-home messages is that there are many different psychoactive chemicals in cannabis, and products derived from cannabis may vary widely in terms of their benefits and side effects. The most obvious example is that CBD and THC seem to have almost opposite effects on the body and the brain, and so the various mixes of cannabis are definitely not equivalent. It's also one of the reasons why I say the clinical trials that have been done to date are inconclusive, because they were really using just a single form of cannabis at a single dose and with a single mix, and that may not be the optimal dose for all people with cannabis. It may be that a more individualized approach will be needed in the future. Secondly is that there is currently no conclusive evidence supporting the benefits of cannabis for any aspect of Parkinson's disease. I feel that the anecdotal evidence in my own clinical experience that cannabis may help with pain, sleep, appetite, nausea, and anxiety. These things have actually been better studied in other populations. For example, in multiple sclerosis, there are several very well done large trials showing that both CBD as well as CBD and THC can help with muscle spasticity. And although it has not yet been done in Parkinson's disease, it's certainly reasonable to suspect that it may be helpful for those symptoms, although further studies are needed. The research to date on motor symptoms and dyskinesias has been either negative or inconclusive. And this would be an area where people, if they wanted to try cannabis, would be doing so kind of at their own risk, and would be best to do so with keeping their physician in the loop and making small and simple changes on a weekly basis. And lastly, that potential side effects do include confusion, low blood pressure, falls, and also pulmonary issues if smoked. As this is a recorded presentation, I unfortunately am not going to be able to take questions. People can feel free to email me, but even better is that I will be doing a presentation for the Parkinson's Foundation, and you can find more information on their website. I believe that presentation will be happening next week, and that will be a live webinar, and you will be able to send questions that would be able to be answered in real time and will be fielded to me. So I thank you for your attention, and hope you found the information presented helpful, and hopefully we will have some better and more conclusive answers in the future, as the field of cannabis research is really just in its infancy. Have a great week.